Yeah, it's a type or a category of something, not anything that is numerically different. And this is real similar when we talk about nominal levels of measurement that we far enough today. But it's not a numerical indicator, it's just a type or a category of something. And then we did mention the idea male, are you female? Are you Democrat, Republican, Independent, or other? Some categories might be defined. Here are 5 different conflict strategies. Here are 4 different persuasive strategies. Those sorts of things. And we'll talk a little more about nominal stuff when we get to levels of measurement. And then, of course, what's an ordered variable?
Number.
Yeah, there's some kind of difference in hierarchy between things. And oftentimes it's a number, but you could imagine an ordered variable that isn't necessarily a number. If somebody said something like, of the following, which is your most preferred, then that would still be an ordered variable because it means that's more preferred than the other ones, but it wouldn't always have to be put down as a number. But generally, there's some kind of number that we would associate with order. Let me give you another example of an ordered variable that wouldn't be numerical. If you were doing things like looking at 3 different stages of relationship development: casual relationship, close relationship, intimate relationship. Well, you wouldn't really associate a numerical value with those necessarily, but they are obviously ordered because one is more intimate than the other, which is more intimate than the other. So there is still some order to them. Another good example would be something like dating, engaged, married. There's obviously different levels there in the relationship, but it wouldn't necessarily be numerical. But, like Caitlin says, a lot of them are, numerical. Then we got into our dependent and independent. How would you describe a dependent variable? I know that most of you had this last week, but just to see.
What you're observing.
What you're observing, what you're measuring. It's the thing that you're observing, the thing that you're measuring. If you are comparing differences in people, it's what you'd be measuring or observing for everyone. But whatever you're observing, whatever you're measuring is a dependent variable. And the independent variable? Yeah, the thing, if something is influencing your dependent variable, the independent variable would be the thing. Is there a difference in the people's scores on the PONS test, the profile of nonverbal sensitivity between males and females? Well, you're saying that, males or females, or your gender there is your independent variable. That's the same thing producing the effect. Every study doesn't have an independent variable, like we had mentioned. Sometimes the independent variable might be done after the fact, those kinds of things. So, and I think everybody had these down from the examples, but does anybody need any other examples of independent and dependent variables? You feel pretty good that you could see a description of a study and then figure out what the independent and the dependent variable was? Let me give you a non-communication example. There's a really fascinating show I was watching within the last week on the Science Channel called The Secret Brain. And they were doing all kinds of really neat sorts of results from research that's been done using, well, a lot of the research is using MRIs to coordinate brain activity. And I'm going to slightly vary the way that they did this one study. But one of the things that they found is that when a behavior becomes automatic and reflexive, like you just get it down and it's an instinctive kind of thing, you no longer have to think about it, that certain areas of the brain actually rewires itself. So those become autonomic or automatic instinctive kind of behaviors, thereby freeing up the cerebral cortical activity, which is what you use to think about and what you use to, cognitively process information. So the more things we habitually get instinctively to learn automatically, we no longer have to consciously think about. So as a slight variation, if we were looking at people who have instinctively mastered a certain behavior as automatic compared to people who have not instinctively mastered a behavior as automatic, and we're looking at these MRI readouts of a person's brain activity, and we see differences in the amount of activity in the cerebral cortex depending upon whether they have learned this activity instinctively or not. What's the dependent variable there? Back to your definition and your description just a few minutes ago. What are you observing or measuring for everyone? The MRI, right? The brain activity is the dependent variable. What's your independent variable? Now, Hannah.
Oh, I don't remember.
The area.
Whether or not you master.
Exactly. Whether or not you mastered the behavior or not, whether the behavior is automatic or not, right? Because that's what you're comparing. Have you mastered this behavior instinctively? Have you not? That's your independent variable, and your dependent variable is what area, what's the activity in the brain, you know, whatever the MRI is printing out. So, again, it's not a communication example, but, you know, the independent, dependent variable kind of concept applies to everything. We did talk about the confounding variables, also sometimes referred to as extraneous variables. It's a confounding variable.
Some other variable that influences the study that you don't have, that you haven't observed.
Absolutely. Some variable that influences the results of the study, potentially at least, that is not part of what you're supposed to be studying. You can account for some confounding variables in the design of the study. Like that was the handout when we talked about the listening study last week, and you had the handout, and I know a lot of the statistical stuff on there, you know, you didn't need to pay that much attention to, but what I was using that for last week was to, you know, when they were comparing people's listening ability, whether there was a pause in a tape or not a pause in a tape, they also asked people questions like, what's your year in school, what's your age, and how would you rate the speaker's delivery? And you see how those would be factored in as potential confounding variables, because you could easily make the argument that, well, somebody might have remembered more because it was a more interesting speaker, not because they, you know, they had the pause in the, when they were delivering the message. So sometimes by doing things like that, what they're doing is they're trying to account that there were not confounding variables. And then in defense of the study, they would go back and they would say, look, we proved, because there was no significant difference in the year in school, the average age, or the delivery ratings, so you could pretty much empirically prove those three things were not confounding variables. So, you know, a lot of times you can structure it into the experiment, you can maybe ask questions to try to account for it. Can you see that benefit of the positivist approach? Because when you're doing that kind of study in a positivist paradigm, it lets you control for a lot of those potential confounding variables. In a naturalistic study, as wonderful as they are, and personally I'm all for the naturalistic research, but you do not have the same kind of control, and if there are potential confounding variables, you know, you can't just necessarily easily statistically, you know, disprove them, but, you know, still, naturalistic has its benefit in that it's more realistic. Real quickly at the end, I did talk about 3 different types of relationships between the dependent and the independent variable. 3 different ways that the independent variable and the dependent variable could be related. We talked about non-causal, recursive, and non-recursive. What's a non-causal relationship between your variables? Yeah, they're associated, but you can't say one thing causes the other. One of the examples I've mentioned at least 2 or 3 times, maybe more, is the study that was done showing a correlation between college attrition and communication apprehension. You know, a positive correlation that students that had higher degrees of communication apprehension had higher likelihoods of dropping out of school. Well, you can't say that not doing well in school causes communication apprehension. You can't say that communication apprehension causes people to drop out of school, but the research does show correlation. It shows that those 2 things are associated in some way or another. What's a recursive relationship between the variables?
It's when one thing causes another, so, but it can't go the other way.
Doesn't necessarily work both ways. You know, a good example is speaker credibility and the degree that people are persuaded or influenced by the speaker. Well, if you increase speaker credibility, you typically have an increased amount of persuasion. Obviously, that's a causal relationship. It's recursive. Higher or lower credibility influences higher or lower persuasiveness. It wouldn't make any sense at all to say higher or lower persuasiveness influences credibility, because the credibility is already in place before you even hear what the message would be. A non-recursive relationship then, just to, you know, expound on that, would be where the causality works both ways. You know, one thing causes one and the other could cause, you know, vice versa. For instance, I think one of the examples I probably used last week was nonverbal sensitivity and empathy. People that are more sensitive of other people's nonverbal also tend to be more empathic, and empathy by definition is being in tune with other people's feelings and other people's perspectives and the way other people see things. Well, you could see easily that being both ways. If you're more empathic by nature, you're probably paying more attention to people's nonverbal behavior, because that's one of the big clues in terms of what somebody's feeling. But you could also see that just being more nonverbally sensitive in general is going to make you more in tune with other people's feelings, because nonverbal is such a common way that people express their emotions. So So that would be a good example where something could work both ways, you know, be that non-recursive kind of relationship. Questions over any of that? Even though we didn't have this on the quiz, it would be worth bringing up as a review. Type 1, type 2 error, this might be on the next quiz and certainly on the exam. What's a type 1 error?
Essentially falsely accept the null hypothesis, falsely reject the null hypothesis.
Exactly, when you incorrectly reject the null hypothesis. That's a good technical description. In a more everyday way of explaining it, what does that mean?
It means you like overreact to the data that you're presented with when really you could have like failed to reject the hypothesis.
Okay, and you could be still accurately analyze it with data, and you get a real accurate, really, the statistical results are really there. But back to our examples of things like confounding variables, that would be the classic example of a type 1 error. Some other thing influenced the results of the study, and even though you did an excellent, precise job of all your statistical analysis and showing significant relationships or differences, if something else influenced the results of the study, then you found some relationship or difference that really isn't there. So the type 1 error, by saying you incorrectly reject the null hypothesis, it means that you find some kind of relationship or association or difference that really isn't there. There was some other reason or explanation for it. And then a type 2 error?
You incorrectly accept the null hypothesis, or you miss the difference that doesn't appear to be there.
Absolutely. You incorrectly accept the null hypothesis, which means you don't find the difference, or you don't find a relationship that really is there. So, I think a nice way just of thinking of that. Type 1, you find something that isn't really there. Type 2, you don't find something that really is there. That's a simple way of putting it, but that would allow you, I think, to recognize that on the exam. Good. Any questions? Okay, that brings us, all of that, the variable stuff, that was all 2 with our method, because where we are here in C with methods. Our 1 under here were some basic background concepts, like triangulation. Another good review question. What's triangulation?
Using more than one method to find your result.
Yeah, using more than one kind of thing for your study. And we did talk about different kinds of triangulation, like measurement triangulation. You're using 2 different kinds of measurements, or more than 2 kinds of measurements. Researcher triangulation, you're using more than one researcher and coordinating the results. You could even have things like theoretical triangulation, where you're interpreting the results with more than one theory, that kind of thing. Your main common use of triangulation is where you're using more than one measurement or more than one assessment, even though, we did identify 4 different kinds of triangulation. And then 1 under here was all of our stuff with variables. 2 was all of our stuff with variables. And then that brings us up to 3 under methods. And that is looking at the actual observing and measuring. There is really absolutely no way of covering every possible measurement and observation approach. It's just infinite. There are some that are more commonly used in our field, and those are some of the ones that we'll focus on in more detail. There are some that you can creatively come up with on your own. There's all the time, researchers coming up with completely new ideas and new ways of observing things and ways of studying things. So really, it's potentially endless. It's not that there's just a set kind of list. Here are different ways of observing and measuring. There are some clearly that are more common, and those are some of the ones at least that we'll focus on. But there's many, many, many different ways of observing and many different ways of measuring something. And again, for those of you that, one of you that have, or any of you that may venture into my communication in the arts class that I taught this last winter, so I'll teach again probably next fall. When we're doing things like a whole variety of interpretation of art forms, we're not really measuring in the sense of using numerical indicators. Well, we are really doing a lot of kinds of research, or, you know, relaying the idea of research in observation, looking for common themes in, you know, somebody's poetry, looking for common techniques that Picasso used in designing his blue period, you know, between 1901 and 1904, looking for common statements that are being made in surrealist art forms, you know, so we're still doing observation, but we're obviously doing, you know, some whole different kinds of observations than a lot of your typical mainstream sort of communication studies stuff. So there are many, many, many different ways of observing and many different ways of measuring. Also, when we're talking about measuring, you've got some samples, and we'll go over some of these examples in class. There's a lot of measurements that are standardized, you know, like, you know, for example, McCroskey and Richmond's PRC 824, which is one of the most common in broad, general kind of measurements of communication apprehension that's used. There's also lots of people that come up with completely new measurements. You know, you're trying to assess something, there isn't a standardized measurement, so you create your own measurement, you create your own assessment. In our second unit, when we get into specific types of methodologies like surveys and content analysis and experiments, just a potentially infinite number of ways of doing a survey and ways of designing your survey questions. Even when you're doing a content analysis where you're actually analyzing the content of some communication, there's some standard categories that you would analyze content in. And then there's a lot of kind of communication studies that are done that there isn't already a set of categories, and so you devise your own categories, you know, as part of the study. So really, there's many, 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 you know, different types. I'm going to key in on some of them and some of the key concepts. And again, trying to keep a focus, at least a lot of the times, on the ones that are more common. It is first necessary to identify two broad categories of ways of observing and measuring. And what we're really doing here is we're identifying two broad categories for types of studies. You know, when you're saying it's this type of study or this type of study, you're really talking about the way that you're going about observing and measuring. And here's where you get into these are terms that you've probably heard before, but here's where we'll actually describe them in more detail. One is qualitative, and the other is quantitative. And again, this isn't just, you know, a specific technique. These oftentimes are entirely different types of studies or different ways of doing study. A qualitative study is not looking at scores and scales. A qualitative study is describing or illustrating or explaining something. You're describing, you're explaining, you could illustrate, and again, we could put other words up here, but you're getting the idea that what you're doing is some way of qualitatively making sense out of your observations rather than using statistical scales and things like that. Back to my example when I was talking about things like different ways of studying the meaning of certain art forms. Well, obviously, you know, that's qualitative. You're looking for common themes, you're identifying common techniques, you know, you're describing, explaining, or illustrating. Here are the common propositions. Here's what the 1924 Surrealist Manifesto set out as the purpose of surrealism as an art form. And then you go back and you look at a bunch of surrealist art and you say, you see how they're doing those things that, you know, Andre Breton established in 1924 that surrealists were looking at. You know, so you're kind of describing or explaining. The actual ways that you're doing these sorts of things, you know, just a couple of different, again, samples. A lot of times you might be using words just to explain things, you know, like again, back to the example of things like explaining art. If you're explaining certain kinds of behavior, there's a lot of ethnographic research that's done on groups and cultures, where you go in and you observe certain kinds of behavior in a culture, and you just kind of use words to describe it. Maybe you want to describe some sort of ritualistic behavior. I think I used this example in here before, or at least a partial related example. There's just some fascinating kinds of examples when you're looking at rituals within a culture, you know, observing a Native American powwow, for example, and looking at a lot of the symbolic kind of behaviors and a lot of the kinds of things that they do. Even some of the symbolic ornamentations, like a dream catcher, for example, which has very specific symbolic meaning, for Native American cultures, those kind of things. So a lot of times you might just be using words, you're just describing and explaining. Sometimes you might be using diagrams or models. If, for example, you are observing the communication flow within the administration at Northern Michigan University, well, I mean, obviously you could do some describing and using words, but wouldn't it be really nice to have some kind of model or some kind of visual diagram showing how the different offices relate to each other in terms of the communication flow, how different offices relate to each other structurally in terms of the hierarchy, which offices are ahead of which offices. Basically what you're creating is you're creating an organizational diagram. If any of you have had organizational communication or had some background in organizational communication, you know that things like communication flow in an organization is tremendously important. And there's some people, I mean, that a major task that they do is trying to, look at the way communication flows in the system and make it as effective and make it as efficient as possible. You end up with a lot of times where you have duplication of effort and wasted resources and things like that. And so this could be a tremendously valuable, sort of thing. So you might use words, you might use diagrams or models. You also might just use symbols. I mean, there's a variety of kinds of other sorts of symbols besides words that you might use. They could be visual symbols, for example, or visual illustrations that, symbolically represent things. So you see what you're doing with qualitative. It's more of a description, an explanation, an illustration. It's not the kind of thing that you're, using a bunch of statistical scores and a bunch of, numerical scales. Quantitative, on the other hand, is numerical, and they are numerical indicators. You might be looking at things like the size of something, the degree of something, the extent, or the amount. But in all of those cases, it's some kind of numerical indicator looking at size, amount, degree, extent. I mean, and again, you could kind of go on here. I'm not intending that necessarily to be an exhaustive list, but when you talk about things like a person's level of communication apprehension, there's a greater degree for some people than there is for others. If you're talking about things like reaction time, there's some fascinating studies that are done in terms of reaction time. People are engaged in some kind of task, and what you're doing is just measuring literally what's the reaction time. You're looking at things like the amount of time it takes. Obviously, you could be looking at the size of things. You could be looking at the degree or the extent of things. There's some kind of numerical indicator. Classic examples: all of our communication style scales, where you fill out these questionnaires and then somebody goes through and tabulates them. For any of you that had me with interpersonal, we actually did some of these in class. We did the, and actually I've got some samples on the handouts that we'll get to, pretty soon. But we scored the rhetorical sensitivity scale in class, and everybody got the numerical scale and score of what your rhetorical sensitivity was. We did the PRCA 24 for communication apprehension. We did the self-monitoring scale, and all of these kind of things. You're identifying different characteristics by these kinds of scales. Quantitative could also be scores. Back to one of the examples I was using a week or so ago of comparing different classes in terms of, the grades, the average grades on exam, daytime classes, nighttime classes. It could be something like, this class compared, 400 level class compared to this other 400 level class. And there you could be looking at things like scores. What are the scores on people's exams, and just comparing the differences. You could also be looking at things like frequencies, how often certain kinds of things occur. You might be doing some kind of conversational analysis, and you're looking at something like the frequency of interruptions that somebody has, or people have, or one group has compared to another group. Even though this isn't done a lot, but this was a big thing that was done in some of the gender studies a while back, where there was a whole bunch of research comparing the frequencies of males interrupting females compared to females interrupting males. And, now we've changed a lot in terms of our interpretation of interruptions, and, interruptions aren't always seen as negative. And it's also not just the idea of, do you interrupt somebody, but it's the idea of, do they give into the interruption, or do you interrupt and then say, gee, I'm sorry, and let the person go on. But as a neat little side question, if we're comparing the male and female frequency of interruptions. Frequency of interruptions is the dependent variable, biological sex of the person is the, male or female is the independent variable. So there would be an example in terms of things like frequencies. You could also do something like frequency, and this is something I would actually like to do, but I do this informally anyway. I notice a big difference in the amount of participation I get from one 110 class compared to another 110 class. And it fascinates me. Now, most of the time, all the upper division classes, there's a whole bunch of participation. I mean, 200 level classes, we have lots in here. 310, or 400, we have lots of participation when you're dealing with groups of majors and minors. But I'm really fascinated sometimes at the complete different characteristics of one SP 110 interpersonal class compared to another. I'll have one class that's very talkative and very involved and very discussion oriented, and then I have another one where they don't seem to talk much at all. So I've thought about things like maybe it's 10 o'clock compared to 12 o'clock, but then as soon as I think, gee, the 12 o'clock classes aren't as talkative, then I end up with something like I did last semester where the 12 o'clock class was 10 times as talkative as my 10 o'clock class was. I think, well, maybe it's a Monday, Wednesday versus a Tuesday, Thursday, but then I'll come across a semester that it's completely different. So I don't really know what the difference is, and it's fascinating because it really does sort of throw out a lot of this idea of randomized, subject collections, why there could be such a difference in one class compared to another class. And it might not be the class in its entirety. It might, I'm obviously doing some brainstorming here. It might also be just the selection of key individuals. Because one of the things I'll notice is if I've got a class where there's a few very discussion-oriented people in the class, that can kind of set the tone for the whole class, and it can spread and create a class that's very talkative. Whereas if I don't have any of those, sort of extra talkative, extra discussion-oriented people, then people just end up kind of being a little more reticent, a little more hesitant. So right there, I could easily see doing some kind of informal observation of frequency of participation in one interpersonal class compared to another interpersonal class, and try to see if there is any way of ascertaining a way of predicting which classes would be more or less. But as of now, I'm somewhat baffled by the way that happens. It could also be time, quantitative. Back to my example when I was talking about, earlier, something like reaction time. Obviously that would be looking at time, the time it takes to complete a task. Even though we don't do this that often in communication research, but even something like distance would be a quantitative variable. Where would the concept of distance relate to interpersonal communication? You're not talking about things like how far is it to one mall compared to another mall. Where would the concept of spatial distance relate to interpersonal communication? Absolutely, like how close people stand, how close people sit. That's done all the time, or at least quite frequently in nonverbal, in a whole variety of different kinds of ways. So yeah, that idea of the proximity would be a good example. So you get a good idea in terms of the general difference between qualitative and quantitative. We'll go through a bunch of examples, and again, we'll back up to this idea in our second unit when we start talking about specific kinds of methodologies. Typically, your experimental designs are more likely to be quantitative. Your surveys, sometimes you can have elements of either one of these, quantitative or qualitative, and then your ethnography, those kinds of research are almost always entirely qualitative. So that just gives you the broad general two categories, the two types of categories. Now, if we wanted to get specific into looking at specific types of measures or observations, and there's three broad categories, and I'm using some slightly different terminology than the text. The text divides these into self-reports, others reports, and behavior, and just because the idea of behavior isn't quite as inclusive as what it should be, my three categories are going to be self-reports, observational measures, and direct measurement, but they do really overlap with each other. I just think that, especially with the direct measurement, it includes a lot more things than just what you would typically think of in behavior. So they really overlap exactly with each other. Specific types. One type, and again, we'll go into a variety of examples here and types, are self-reports. Somewhere down the line, I'm going to back up. Obviously, self-reports are where the people being studied are reporting their own information. They're reporting their own data. Now, this can be qualitative or quantitative. okay? It doesn't always have to be quantitative. Lots of the self-reports that you're probably used to or have been exposed to in our field have been quantitative, you know, a lot of scales, a lot of measurements. And again, I'll go through some of the samples that you have in your handouts. But self-reports could be qualitative as well. I think I used the example last week of the one friend of mine that when she was doing her dissertation at Purdue, she studied the, I don't know if I mentioned this in here or not actually, she studied the perceptions that children have of divorce. Did I talk about that in here? Yeah, okay, well, that was obviously qualitative. I mean, you're not sitting an 8-year-old kid down and having him or her fill out some questionnaire. You know, you just sit down and have the kids engage in a narrative. Describe to me what's happening in your family or what happened in your family. How do you perceive this, you know, and you're just getting the child's description, and then she comes back and she's trying to give, you know, some kind of explanation and description of the way children tend to view divorce. What's divorce like from the empathic understanding of the child, rather than just, you know, the way that we would impose that definition on the child. So obviously a self-report could be qualitative as well. I gave an example, I think, when I was teaching the advanced interpersonal class, and the project that they would do is they would actually interview 5 people that were in romantic relationships, and we did a class study. Now 5 people aren't, you know, isn't that big of a sample size, but you figure if I had a class of 20 people and each person was interviewing 5 people, then at the end of the semester, I could pull all of that together and we would end up with like 100 different interviews. So, you know, that was pretty good, and it was really interesting kind of results. Well, one of the things that they did qualitatively was ask people to describe what's your definition of intimacy, what's your perception of intimacy. And there wasn't any kind of numerical indicator there in terms of, you know, that the person would respond with. You're simply looking and you're trying to explain what are the different ways that people, you know, view intimacy, that people perceive intimacy. Obviously, a lot of self-reports are quantitative, you know, scales. Surveys, every kind of survey, if you're asking people about their own opinions or their own attitudes or their own behaviors, you know, those are obviously self-reports. Many style characteristics and measurements are self-report. You give people questionnaires and then you get feedback, you know, from however they answer the questionnaires. Some of the specific types of examples. Let me just give you some kind of examples here of objectives for self-reports. And again, these are just examples of objectives. It's not by any means an exhaustive list, but there's some of the ones that, you know, are more characteristic in our communication studies. One, for instance, would be looking at things like characteristics. Asking people information that would reveal things about their own personal characteristics. And again, sometimes these can be very open-ended, sometimes they can be more standardized. One of the ones that we'll mention in communication theory is Coombs 20 statements test, where you simply sit back and you ask people, write 20 self-descriptive statements, just 20 statements that you think describe yourself. And then you go through and you identify how many of these statements seem to be indicating an external locus of control, how many tend to be indicating an internal locus of control, and just by the sheer balance of how many external and internal do you have of those 20 statements, you make the conclusion this person is more, you know, extrinsically controlled, this person's more intrinsically controlled, that sort of thing. There's lots of other kinds of characteristics. Again, on your samples that you have, I'm assuming they all got put together the same. On your first page, not the ones from today, the ones from last week, you should have the strongly agree to strongly disagree, and number 1, do you need an extra?
I didn't realize there was a handout today. I didn't get anything today.
You didn't get the handouts?
No.
Yeah, there were 2 handouts today, but the one we're on now is the one from last week. Anybody else not get today's? They just passed you right by, people?
Yeah, I don't know where they came from.
So, on the first page here, this is, everybody got this one? This is McCroskey and Richmond's, the revision of their PRCA. This one's actually called the PRCA 24. PRCA, you know, stands for Personal Report of Communication Apprehension. One of the more common measurements that's used to assess an individual's self-report of their general communication apprehension. PRCA 24, Personal Report of Communication Apprehension. The reason why it's called the PRCA 24 is there was a previous version, and they revised it and restructured it and things like that, and the one that they came up with as the revision has 24 items, and that's why it's the PRCA 24. This is a general measure of communication apprehension because they've actually categorized 4 different types of anxiety. Questions 1 through 6 are talking about group behavior, group communication. Questions 7 through 12 are talking about things like meetings, professional communication. Items 13 through 18 are talking more about interpersonal communication, and then items 19 through 24 are talking about public speaking. And so this is why it's considered more of a general assessment, because you're looking at 4 different kinds of situations: groups, professional meetings, interpersonal, and public speaking. And the score you get is sort of this overall ambient tendency towards communication apprehension. But you can see that it wouldn't necessarily be situationally specific, right? Somebody might have real high anxiety when it comes to public speaking, but low anxiety in all 3 of the other areas, so they score moderate. Somebody else might have moderate apprehension all the time, and so they score moderate. So you can't make direct comparisons just on the basis of somebody's score, because you are really looking at 4 different dimensions or 4 different aspects of communication apprehension. One of the interesting things about some measurements, and I'll come back to this before we're done, but let me just point it out on this one. Do you notice the reverse phrasing of some of these items? Like, for example, think conceptually. Since we're looking at this is a quantitative measure, obviously. If you look at something like number 2, generally I am comfortable while participating in a group discussion. If a person says number 1, I strongly agree, can you see how that mathematically makes sense? Because that should score as a 1, because that's indicating a low degree of anxiety. But then look at something like question 1. I dislike participating in group discussions. Can you see if somebody answers, I strongly agree to that one? Numerically, it doesn't make sense to score that as a 1, because that's indicating more anxiety, whereas number 2, an answer of 1 indicates less anxiety. So it's very common on some of these kinds of measurements that you have that reverse phrasing, and there's various reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is to keep somebody from just going down and answering a bunch of numbers without actually reading the questions, where they say, well, I don't have much anxiety, and so they go down and they put 1s on everything. Well, as soon as you just glance at that person's answers, you know right away they didn't really read it, because some of these, if you put a 1 on, it means you probably put a 5 on, some of the other ones. So when you're actually scoring this, you have to account for that. You have to reverse the numerical value in one way or another of some of those ones that have reverse phrasing. So on some self-report measures of characteristics, always having a higher or low number doesn't always mean you're more or less of that characteristic. You might have to go back and reverse some of those values. Now we'll come back to that, because I've got the other handout you got today, or one of the other ones, is some samples of the reverse phrasing, just to see if you could recognize some of those. But that's just, one kind of example. You understand what I mean with the reverse phrasing. Take something like public speaking. Number 20, certain parts of my body are rigid when I give a speech. Which answer there is going to be more indicative of high anxiety? Strongly agree or strongly disagree? Strongly agree, right? Number 21, I feel relaxed when I give a speech. Which is going to mean higher anxiety? Strongly disagree, right? So strongly agreeing to one question means high anxiety. Strongly disagreeing to another one means high anxiety. So that you have to account for that. You can't just go down and add up the numbers. You have to mathematically account for that. Just as one sample, though. Obviously a quantitative measure, rather than qualitative. Again, I'm just some samples. If you look at your second page, what you should have, if they all got put together in the same order, 25 true, false. Is that what you have? This is Snyder's self-monitoring scale. Again, just as a sample, this is, actually I've got the same ones here that, with the exception of one that people had in 110. This is a little different than your strongly agree or strongly disagree or very characteristic or very uncharacteristic. This dichotomizes people's responses. In other words, you only have 2 options, true, false. You don't have that middle range of uncertain or sometimes true, sometimes false. So it sort of forces people to either answer true or false. And so, you know, what we explain to people, and it's even in the instructions, is answer on the basis of what is mostly true or mostly false, even though, you know, there would obviously be some exceptions. And then you simply count up the number and, you know, what self-monitoring is, and again, you don't need to know the concept, most of you or many of you might know anyway or remember. And we're gonna go over it in comm theory when we talk about communicator style characteristics, probably tomorrow night. High self-monitoring is where people are more focused externally, like what are other people doing, how do other people perceive me. Low self-monitoring is where they're more focused internally, like what do I think I should do, you know, what's my evaluation of myself. And then you simply add up the people's scores, and it can be anywhere from a 0 to a 25. 0 to 12 is low self-monitoring, 13 to 25 is high. One of the interesting things about this particular kind of characteristic measurement is there's no moderate range. You know, people are either polarized as being high self-monitors or low self-monitors. Even though this is used a lot of times in communication, because self-monitoring is very highly related potentially to a variety of other communication behaviors and characteristics, it actually comes from social psychology. Mark Snyder, the one who, you know, who created this scale, is, you know, was a social psychologist at the University of Minnesota, I think it was. So again, just another sample. On your next 2 pages are actually part of the same questionnaire. It's a 40-item questionnaire. This is Hart's rhetorical sensitivity questionnaire. This one's a little different in that the way that the questions are worded, it's not asking what people do, it's asking what people think you should do. So, more technically speaking, rather than actually assessing characteristics here, it's really assessing people's communication attitudes. You know, like number 1, people should be frank and spontaneous in conversations. Number 2, an idea can be communicated in a different way. Number 12, a supervisor in a work situation must be forceful with subordinates to be effective. Number 14, look before you leap is the most important rule to follow when talking to others. Or 13, a person should tell it like it is. You notice it's not really assessing anything that a person does, but it is assessing what are your attitudes. It's a good assessment of communication attitudes. And you end up with different categories. That, for this class, isn't relevant, you know, what the categories are, but again, we're gonna talk more about this in comm theory, as we did in interpersonal communication, but everybody in comm theory didn't necessarily have the same interpersonal communication class. So just another kind of example. You actually end up with a numerical score, but instead of just having a high-low kind of thing, depending upon what your profile is on all 3 scores, your noble self, your rhetorical reflector, and your rhetorical sensitive score, you end up someplace on the model. So it is a quantitative measure, but when you end up identifying people's style, you're actually using a diagram to illustrate their style, but it's based on a numerical score. Another, just to give you another sampling of something different on your next page, and actually the next 2 pages are variations of the, not variations, but they're sort of 2 different views of the same scale. This is Moravian's emotional eliciting scale, and basically the way that this kind of self-report would be used is you're exposing people to some kind of stimuli, some kind of external stimuli, and in one, I mean, it could be anything. It could be a conversation, it could be music, it could be visual imagery, I mean, it could be anything. And you're assessing what their emotional reactions are. And so what you've got on the first page of the scale is the way that this would be presented to your subjects that are doing their reporting. And, you know, they would simply go down and mark the appropriate check box. Now, each box is associated with a numerical value. When you actually started tallying it up, you know, it goes from a -4 to a +4 with a 0 in between. So you end up with a 9-point scale, you know, a numerical indicator. And again, I'll refer back to this when we talk about interval levels of measurement. But this is the way it would be presented to the person. And there again, you can see that they're mixed up in terms of, you know, the positivity or negativity. You know, on the left side, you've got things like unhappy, bored, but you've also got things like satisfied and pleased. You know, on the right side, you've also got positive and negative. So you're sort of mixing these up as well. And again, that adds a little bit of reliability to the scale, because that way somebody doesn't just go down and check a bunch of boxes without actually reading what they are. Now, when you're doing Moravian's emotional scale, there's actually 3 different dimensions to a person's emotions. Multi-dimensional concept. It's not just what is the emotion. And this is the way it would be presented to people. Not that we would give it to non-people, but you know what I mean, in terms of your subjects. When you look at the next page, this is the way that it would actually look when you came to the point of analyzing it. Here is where you've taken all of these items that are mixed up, where you have some positive and some negative on the left or the right side of the continuum, and now you have them all matched. You convert whatever the person's actual score was, or their answers, now you have them all matched, where all the stuff on the left are the positive emotions, all the stuff on the right are the negative emotions, and that's why it makes sense now to put in the numbers, because everything on the left is, you know, a plus, everything on the right is a minus, and then of course 0 would be neutral in between. And what this also does is, it also clusters together the individual questions or categories under the 3 broad dimensions. So really, an emotional response according to Moravian's scale and Moravian's theoretical ideas, emotions are multidimensional. It involves 3 different things. Pleasure, which is how much do you like or dislike the emotion. Arousal, or the stimuli. Arousal, which is to what degree are you feeling the emotion, you know, the intensity of the emotion. And dominance, which is the emotion controlling you, or are you in control of the emotion? Okay, I mean, even, you know, take something like anxiety. Some people can feel anxiety, but you could still be in control of the anxiety. That's a whole different thing than the anxiety being in control of you. So, actually, according to Moravian's scale, emotional responses are multidimensional. It includes pleasure, arousal, and dominance as 3 different kinds of emotions. So here's where you'd actually sort of coordinate them and assess it. Again, just another sample of potentially infinite number of types of characteristics that we might measure or assess. Now, you notice even with doing this, the Moravian kind of is good to have in there for a couple of different reasons. One reason is it's not a personality characteristic, it's a situational characteristic, right? All 3 of the others are more trait-oriented, right? What's your degree of communication apprehension as a trait? What are your communication attitudes about rhetorical sensitivity as a trait? What's your views in terms of your focus of attention, external or internal, with self-monitoring as a trait? Moravian's is more of a situational characteristic, right? In this situation, what are your emotional responses? So when we're saying characteristics, it doesn't always have to mean it's a personality characteristic or a trait. It could be your characteristic in this particular situation. And again, that's one of the reasons I think it's good to use the Moravian scale as a contrast, or at least as a variant, you know, of the other 3 types. Now again, there's many examples of characteristics and traits. You know, I'm just giving you some sampling. You will find sometimes with some trait measurements like this that are observing by way of a self-report, you end up with an ambiguity of, if you do have a moderate category, you end up with a potential ambiguity of a moderate category. Now, this isn't true of every different example of a self-report characteristic, but on some. For instance, let's say you had something like a 1 to 5 scale, and you had a whole bunch of different items that you were answering. If somebody goes through and they answer 1 on half of them, and they answer 5 on half of them, what's this going to average out to, right? Your overall mean is going to average out to a 3. On the other hand, if somebody goes through that same scale and they answer a 3 on everything, what is your overall average going to be? Your mean is still going to be a 3. So both of these 2 people could end up with the exact same scale, or the exact same score, the exact same mean, and both of them be categorized right in the middle of the scale. Can you see the difference, though, in the 2 people? I mean, aren't they really characteristically entirely different? One point is moderate all the time. The other point, or the other person, goes back and forth between the 2 extremes. So, you know, it is important to recognize that sometimes when you're doing these characteristic scales, you know, just labeling something as high, moderate, and low, you do have some potential ambiguity as to what's meant by moderate. You could score moderate because you go back and forth between the 2 extremes. You could also score moderate because you are moderate most of the time. Now, there are some ways of accounting for this. And again, we don't have to worry about this now, but when we get into our third unit and we're doing our stuff on statistics and we talk about things like standard deviation or variance, this is one of the reasons for that, because the standard deviation shows what a person's score, how much their score varies from the mean, and at least that's one way potentially of identifying on individual items, maybe, which one of these two characteristics it might fall under. So all characteristic scales don't have this problem, but you can see that some of them, potentially could. You have that ambiguity potentially in terms of what's meant by moderate. Another kind of objective, at least an example that's very common within our field, is measuring people's attitudes or opinions. All the survey kind of research that's done in terms of attitudes and opinions. There's a lot of this that's done in environmental communication, in terms of people's awareness of issues, how important people think ecological issues are, what are your attitudes about, recycling and alternative fuels and these kinds of things. We obviously have just a slew of these kinds of studies done on politics, political communication. I mean, we're just inundated with that now, with the election and process. This isn't unique to communication. I mean, obviously news correspondents or news agencies are doing it too. Political scientists are doing it as well. But it obviously makes sense that communication scholars are doing a lot as well. Could be, assessing things in terms of tracking the amount of people that are supporting one candidate or another candidate. There's a lot of research that's done on the political debates, asking people, their opinions of who they thought won the debates and what their opinions were in terms of one candidate or another candidate. I include a whole bunch of this stuff in my persuasion class, my SP 401 class, and I have a whole bunch of tables and charts and stuff like that on whatever the most recent presidential election was. So for the last few years, the one that we've been using has been based on the 2008 election between McCain and Obama. And with this election now, next semester when I teach persuasion, I'll be able to update all of those, and we'll be looking at all of those results from the 2012 debates, that are coming up around the corner. But it's really just some fascinating kinds of research that's done, and it's just tremendously extensive in terms of, attitudes and opinions. Another kind of place that you find a lot of this kind of self-report is in persuasion research, where you're trying to find out what makes people more or less persuaded. And so they're exposed to different kinds of manipulations, or they're exposed to different kinds of messages, and then you give them questionnaires asking what their opinions are, and usually very often it's a pre-test, post-test, seeing if their attitude changed after they were, exposed to a certain kind of message. There's a lot of real-world practical application for this kind of research, even in terms of some potential careers, where you're trying to decide something like which television commercial is going to persuade people more, which television commercial does somebody find more pleasant or more enjoyable, which kind of public service message is going to be more likely to get people to donate blood or to donate money every month to the Children International Program, which is that wonderful organization that provides food and clothing and resources and things like this to children around the world that are in, very impoverished kind of areas. So, there's some very real-world practical application of this kind of attitude research, where you're trying to basically find out what's the most effective message that we could possibly get out there. If you really want people to donate to this charitable organization, obviously you want to use the most effective message. And so there's a lot of times you're doing research where you're saying which appeal is more effective, which message is more persuaded, which message is going to be more likely to have people do the things that we want them to do. And you can just simply be assessing their attitudes and opinions. Again, also in persuasion, when we talk about a variety of different persuasion theories, and we go into these in a lot more detail in the 401 class, but we have a little subsection that we do in com theory as well. A lot of that research and those theories have been based on, years and years of research done showing, different things that will influence people's attitudes and opinions. So just another real common kind of example. And you can see this overlapping with attitudes, but there's a lot of self-reports that are basically assessing people's perceptions of things, in one way or another. Some of this could obviously overlap with things like attitudes and opinions, but you can see how you could be assessing a lot of things just in terms of people's perceptions, how they see things. I think, just essentially infinite number of kind of examples. And there's many, many, many others. Perceptions, you could be talking about perceptions of yourself, Some of these might be perceptions of others, you know, you're still assessing this person, but you're using what you're assessing is your report of how you see other people. Now, that's not really assessing the other people, that's assessing your perceptions of the other people. Just some samples and examples, but really, I mean, the list of these kinds of objectives, you know, could go on and on and on in terms of the potential things that you could be looking for, or you could be studying. I do want to go in and talk about a whole different kind of self-report, but before I do, just to see if you have this reverse phrasing thing down, if you take the single handout that you have that came around today, just to see if you can recognize, you know, that reverse phrasing sort of thing. These are some examples of a self-report scoring sample. If we were measuring from very uncharacteristic as a 1 to very characteristic as a 5, and in example number 1, what we were studying was people's degree of empathy. Now again, empathy is your sensitivity and awareness of other people's feelings and thoughts and perspectives. Which of these items under empathy, A, B, C, or D, which one of these would you need to reverse the numerical score value because a higher number actually indicates less empathy instead of more empathy? Again, if you're talking about a quantitative measure, bigger numbers should mean more empathy, smaller numbers should mean less empathy. So, for number 1, I am very sensitive, or A, I'm very sensitive to other people's feelings. Does it make sense that way, or would you need to invert that? That makes sense, right? To say 5, very characteristic, it means you're more empathic. Number 2, I focus more on how other people's opinions affect me than trying to understand why they feel that way. What's that? That one you have to flip, right? Because to say that's very characteristic, I'm more concerned with how you affect me than what you're feeling. I mean, that's the exact opposite of empathy. So that one you have to reverse, because a bigger number actually means less empathy instead of more. C, I have a low tolerance for people who are different than me. You have to flip that one, right? Again, empathic people, you know, you would expect to have more tolerance. D, I try to be careful not to say things that will unnecessarily upset another person. That one's fine as is, right? So A and D, the 1s and the 5s make sense. B and C, you have to flip those because bigger numbers actually mean less of that quality. 2, attitude towards listening attentiveness. You know, more positive attitudes about attentiveness would be your 5, not as positive attitudes about attentiveness would be your 1s. So A, people should only pay attention to others if the topic is interesting. Yeah, that would have to be reversed, right? Because to say that's very characteristic, that's actually indicating a low positive attitude about attentiveness, not a high one. B, I often daydream during class presentations. That would not make sense that way as well, right? Higher number would mean less attentiveness, lower number would mean more. C, I listen attentively to student speeches and presentations. That makes sense. D, people should ask follow-up questions to be sure they correctly understand what another person is trying to explain. That makes sense as well, right? So what you do is A and B, you flip the numerical value. In other words, by saying flip the value, 1 would become a 5, 5 would become a 1, 2 and a 4 would reverse. What would you do with the 3? Stays the same, because that's in the middle. You get the idea, so let's zip through these other ones fairly quick. Public self-consciousness. Public self-consciousness is where the person is being more concerned with focusing on others and what they think and do. High public consciousness, you do more of that. Low public consciousness, you don't do as much of that, you focus more internally. So rather than going through each one of those, are any of those ones that you would need to reverse, where answering a 5 is actually indicating less public consciousness instead of more? Who said that? Yeah, very good. A, B, and D would all make sense as is, right? I'm concerned with what other people think. I try to communicate the way other people expect me to. I put a lot of effort into making a good impression. C, however, I'm more interested in my true beliefs than saying what others want to hear. Actually, they are saying a 5 would indicate lower public consciousness, so A, B, and D would stay the same. C, you'd reverse. What about 4? This is basically assessing, let's say we were assessing here is whether people had positive attitudes about androgyny. androgyny, you know, is where somebody has high amounts of both masculine and feminine characteristics. A, women should be much more feminine than masculine, obviously, right? If somebody says that's very characteristic, that's exactly the opposite of an androgynous attitude. B, C, and D would all make sense though, right? Higher numbers means more androgyny. Femininity and masculinity both are desirable. A man who is feminine should not be perceived as behaving like a woman. I'm attracted to people who are androgynous. All of those are very high in terms of androgyny. What about with 5? Relationship satisfaction. Bigger numbers should mean more satisfied. Lower numbers should mean less satisfied. Which of those would you need to switch around for it to make sense? Yeah, those are good. Yeah, those are good. Yeah, B makes sense, right? Our relationship's based on open communication and mutual trust. But A, C, and D, answering very characteristic for all of those is actually indicating low satisfaction, right? I think more about what's wrong in our relationship than what's good about it. I like C, not that I like it personally, but you can see the neat implication there. I can tolerate our relationship until something better comes along. And D, our relationship doesn't seem as good as that it could be. So all of those would have to be reversed. Anybody not understand what we're doing here? Jordan?
No.
You don't
Yeah,
understand?
nope, don't get it.
What is it that you don't understand?
How are you scaling, like, how is, like, what do you mean, like, by one is more than the other?
Well, take for example, number 1, empathy. A 5, very characteristic, should mean higher empathy. A 1, being a smaller number than a 5 is, should mean less empathy. So you look at something like A, I'm very sensitive to other people, it makes sense that a 5 is more empathy and a 1 is less empathy. But on B, I focus more on how other people's opinions affect me than trying to understand the way they feel. If somebody says 5, that's very characteristic, that's actually indicating low amounts of empathy. Whereas a 1, very uncharacteristic, that would actually be indicating high empathy. Just like, maybe think of it this way, when we're doing the communication apprehension scale, if somebody's saying it's very characteristic or I strongly agree that I like group discussions, well there, if you say I strongly agree with that, that means that that's not much anxiety. If somebody said I strongly agree that I dislike group discussions, then the strongly agree actually means more communication anxiety. So you're just kind of having to make the numbers switch around so they make conceptual sense that bigger numbers mean more of something, lower numbers mean less of something. Okay, again, just some samples of you know, some of the objectives of self-reports. And again, you know, really, the list goes on and on. I mean, you know, there's many examples. I just kind of wanted to go through some samples. Some concepts that we've talked about, though, even though we're talking about samples, still, you know, apply to a wide variety of types of objectives. Another type of self-report, besides just giving people questionnaires, is conducting interviews. Now you have to have somebody doing the interviewing, but it's still a self-report, right? Because the information that the person is giving you, that you're doing the interview with, that's their self-report. So here we're talking about things like, you know, scales and questionnaires. Here we're talking about just sitting down and conducting interviews with people. Again, your interviews can be qualitative or quantitative. There are some times in interviews that, I don't know if you've ever, well, I'm sure some of you have, you know how a lot of times now with, when you're calling in someplace like the airlines or ordering something online, they ask if you'll participate in a brief survey afterwards. Sometimes if you order something online, you get an email, you go to the website, and now that's more of the, you know, doing the actual survey. But some of these are interviews, even though it's an automated kind of interview. You know, they're saying things like, how likely would you be to recommend the salesperson that, you know, with whom you spoke? Or, you know, how knowledgeable was the salesperson about the, you know, about the information and the products? You know, how friendly and nice were they? Those kinds of things. Well, that's an automated interview, but it's still an interview. You know, you're still doing a survey. You're just doing a survey by interview. There's a lot of telephone interviews, you know, which is basically a survey. It's just a variation. Instead of giving them the survey, you know, you're calling them up and you're asking them over the phone. However, there's a lot of interviews that are, you know, much more open-ended. You know, you're asking people to explain things. You're asking people to describe things. much more qualitative than quantitative. It's not just on a scale of 1 to 5, you know, and then you have to go back after the fact then, and you have to, you know, describe and illustrate and explain. You know, sometimes this is actually a good case for where you do content analysis, where, you know, if you've interviewed 100 people, you're not individually gonna talk about every 100. What you do is you start looking for commonalities in the types of answers that people gave, and then you could say, well, of the 100 people that we interviewed, there seemed to be 5 main kinds of answers that people had. And then you would describe and explain what those 5 different types of, you know, of answers would be. My example that I had mentioned a bit ago with studying children's perceptions of divorce, you know, those were interviews, you know, those didn't give kids questionnaires, you know, or scales. You know, she would just talk to the children in a very informal way, you know, getting them to, you know, provide their narratives, that kind of thing. So you get a lot of good kind of self-report information from interviews. This is also one of the ways that a lot of times when you're studying something that you don't have a lot of background information on, like another culture or an organization, you're going into an organization and you're trying to make sense out of how the organizational hierarchy works. Well, obviously, interviews are the way to go. You know, you've got to go in, you've got to interview a whole bunch of different people. You know, you're creating your diagrams, creating, you know, having your own notes. We had a good example of this last year where one of the things that departments do every now and then at Northern is we have to do a self-evaluation. And we were sort of ahead of the ballpark as a department in terms of bringing in an outside consultant. And we like the idea of kind of being ahead of the game and having this already done now. But we actually brought in an outside consultant, a professor from California, and basically his end objective was to write an evaluation of our department and, you know, a characterization of our department, obviously qualitative, but the way that he gathered his data was a whole bunch of interviews. I mean, he did things like look at our program and the catalog and those kind of things, but he did extensive interviews. I mean, he interviewed the faculty, he interviewed sub-areas, he interviewed the dean or some representative for the dean, he interviewed, you know, people in COHOTUS or representatives of the administrative people in COHOTUS, and then he sort of packaged all this together into a very, very positive, you know, highly praised. I mean, he just had tremendously, you know, positive things to say about our department, about our programs and everything like that. The only things in there that were critical in any way at all was nothing, you know, I'm just giving you some of the real world results here, had nothing to do with the way that we do things. It was more things like resources, like that, you know, faculty and students maybe should have the option or the availability of having Macs instead of PCs only. Things like we seem to have a need for more instructors because we have to keep offering less and less courses because we don't have enough instructors, and we just lost another one last year. You know, we hired 2 to replace our retiring 3. So any of the criticisms weren't really criticisms at all of our department or our program. All of that was just tremendously highly praised. It was just things in terms of things that could be better for us as a department, like more support, maybe more money coming in, you know, that kind of thing. So it was really neat. But where a lot of that came from was, you know, doing interviews and finding, you know, and doing those kind of interviews. This is the way a lot of cultural research is done as well. You know, you want to go and you want to study some Aboriginal tribe in Australia. You probably don't have a lot of background theory, and there might not be a whole lot of previous research done, you know, so you've got to go into that culture, and you've got to sit down with these people and, you know, maybe need translators, maybe not need translators, and conduct these interviews, and you're trying to package together this ethnographic, very naturalistic kind of picture of, you know, the Aboriginal Australian tribe. Now, a couple of things to mention with interviews. You do have some different kinds of formats with interviews. And this is a real simple thing, and I think you could just kind of visually, just by the phrase, you could visualize what the difference is. And that's tunnel, funnel, and inverted funnel. I don't have to write them all down. Tunnel, funnel, and inverted funnel. And what the difference is between the tunnel, funnel, and inverted funnel format is, it's dealing with the relationship in the progression of questions and the degree of specificity. So, for example, a tunnel format. As you progress through the interview, there's no progressive increase or decrease in specificity. You might have some questions that are more specific than others, but it's not a design to the interview itself, a structural design where you're progressively becoming more specific or progressively becoming more general. It's just that you're asking a whole variety of questions, and they might not differ in specificity at all, or you might just be jumping around with different degrees of specificity. So, you know, it's more like you envision a tunnel, where the two sides are equal the whole way. A funnel format, you know, thinking that things funnel from the top down usually, unless you're dealing with, you know, anti-gravity where it would go up, but let's not worry about that for now. Let's assume, you know, things go down through the funnel. Here, what would be the progressive specificity or generality of your questions?
They would start general and get way more specific.
Absolutely. You start more general, and then you progressively get more specific. Now, how specific do you get? How general do you start? It doesn't really matter. It's just the idea that there is a progression to the interview, that as you proceed, your questions are progressively getting more specific. Can you see how this is very, very, very likely? You okay? You see how this could be a very likely thing when you're doing things like interviewing people in relationships? You're much, much, much more likely to start out really broad and really general, and then get more specific, you know, as you do, and, you know, as you go on. This is, even though it's not always intentionally structured this way like a study, this is the way that many counselors will proceed in their interviews with clients. You know, the first day you sit down, they don't usually start out, question number one, tell me about your secret hidden fears you've had since you were a child. You know, you're gonna start a little more general in terms of, you know, things about the person, and then you're progressively going to get more specific as you proceed through the interview. So, again, the reason why you want to have some structure is because if you're intentionally trying to do this, progressively getting more specific, you'd want to be sure that each of your questions progressively were, you know, either as specific or more specific as the ones that preceded it, so you have the correct order. And then, of course, the inverted funnel would be just sort of if you did the funnel the other way around, which would be obviously what? Exactly, starting specific and then getting progressively, you know, more general, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead.
For the inverted funnel one, what's like the benefits to that?
It depends on the objective. When you start more specific, you know.
Are you talking specific, like what's your secret fear when you're a kid specific?
Well, I don't think that would be a very practical place for the inverted funnel. Where I would, what initially comes to mind in terms of thinking something like an inverted funnel is, let's say we go back to something like the outside consultant coming in and doing an evaluation for the university. You could see them starting off with really specific things like what classes do you teach? What's your degree? What's your area of specialization? What are your main things that you feel about the sub-area? How do you feel the sub-area fits within the department? What's your perception of the university as a whole and how much the university supports the department? So you could I'm thinking of organizational kinds of interviews where you're starting more specific in terms of what you do and what you think about what you do, and then you progressively get bigger to your department and another department and then the whole organization. That's one kind of example that would come to mind where that would probably make sense.
Thank you.
Just another real quickie on the interviews, and this is something I would think that all of you know intuitively, and you certainly will know it quick. And that's the difference between open-ended and closed-ended questions. What's the difference? What's it? Joe?
Say you're working at like a store, say like working at a store, instead of saying, can I help you find something, which is like yes or no, say, what did you come in for today?
Yeah, yes, exactly. The open-ended question is where there's no specific response that's implied, like yes, no, that kind of thing. You know, and that's a good example actually. What did you come in for? Describe. What do you think about this? How do you define this? You know, it's an open-ended question. What's your opinions of President Obama and former Governor Romney? You know, just an open-ended kind of question like that. Closed-ended is where there's a definite list of potential responses. Yes, no. Do you support him? Do you support her? You tend to vote yes or no. You know, it's a closed-ended kind of thing. Just as a little, again, as a little side note, obviously when you're thinking about, if you're doing research where you're really trying to get a more naturalistic understanding of people's perceptions and things like this, Lots of open-ended questions are really good there, because the more closed-ended questions that you have, the more you constrain the other person's option. You know, you wanna ask open-ended questions. You always find out more about a person by asking open-ended questions. One of the things we do when we interview, like, again, you know, we just went through all the interviewing process last year when we were, you know, hiring Tom and Jess in our department. And one of the things that we really do a lot of when we're doing these interviews is a whole lot of open-ended kinds of questions, because you find out a lot more about a person that way. Things like, you know, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What kind of course would you like to design as a new course? You know, what kinds of things do you do to motivate students in classrooms? You know, those kinds of things, when you're getting a lot more information by asking these open-ended responses. Just another thing, just because it's so important in general, when you're communicating with kids anytime, and this isn't just studying, you know, children, but communicating with kids, one of the things that a lot of times adults that really don't communicate as well and effectively with kids, it's because they just ask a bunch of closed-ended responses, like a bunch of yes-no kind of things. Do you like that? Do you like this? Is that your toy? Do you watch Phineas and Ferb? You know, those kind of things. And it's just a whole bunch of yes-no kind of answers. The child doesn't have to communicate that much. You're much better off than when you're communicating with a child to ask questions and phrase questions in a way that require the child to actually explain his or her answer instead of just a bunch of yes-no kind of answers. And again, that's still the same rationale. You know, you learn more about people, you know, when you do the open-ended. But there are a lot of interviews that closed-ended responses are perfectly fine. You know, would you be willing to teach this course? You know, that kind of thing. You know, it's a yes or no, or I guess you could ask for maybe. Any questions that are conducive to or naturally fall within those closed-ended responses, you know, that makes a lot of sense. There is another kind of self-report, and this could be an interview, this could also be a questionnaire, but it is another type of self-report that's worth mentioning and talking at least a little about, and that's a retrospective self-report. A retrospective self-report is where you're asking people, it is an interview kind of thing, or it could be a questionnaire. It's still a self-report, though, that's either way. But you're asking people to provide information based on something that happened previously. You know, going back and asking people, again, whatever the format is, whether it's a person-to-person interview or a questionnaire or something like that, you're asking something like, you know, what were the reinforcement methods that your parents used on you when you were a child, you know, for behavior modification? How well did you get along with your siblings when you were 5 years old? How did that change when you were 10 years old? Assuming, of course, you know, that you had siblings, that kind of thing. One of the kind of places that they've used retrospective self-reports, this one type of study that has just come to mind, was trying to ask people in romantic relationships how their relationship started to begin with. You know, and one of the things that they were looking for in this particular study is, did your relationship begin as a romantic relationship, or did it start out as friends and it just kind of progressed into a more romantic relationship? And so you're getting people to kind of go back and reflect, saying, well, gee, I guess this is how our relationship originally developed, or how our relationship, you know, became romantic or became, you know, more intimate. Now, some things to keep in mind when you're talking about retrospective self-reports. What would you think would be a limitation of retrospective self-reports? You're asking people to go back. Now, if you're talking about retrospective in terms of something like last election, that's not going to be a big deal. But if you're asking people to go back at the beginning of a long-term relationship, or back to their childhood, or back to their adolescent years, and that kind of thing, what would you think would be a limitation of the retrospective self-reports?
The accuracy of the memory.
Yeah, one thing is, people don't remember things accurately. I mean, how much do you really remember, you know, accurately about what happened when you were 5? Even what happened at the beginning of the relationship. Just the idea in terms of the accuracy of recall could be flawed. What were you going to say, Caitlin? Didn't you have your hand up?
Oh, I had the same answer.
Same thing? More?
I would say that you'd be biased because of events that have happened between them.
Absolutely. Another big thing with retrospective self-reports is you might reframe or change the way you view things. At the time, it might have been this way, But now that other things have happened, you go back and you might really evaluate things differently. Just look at how often this happens in a relationship. If you're asked to retrospectively evaluate previous relationships, look at how differently you might have thought of that relationship at the time you were in it, and now 4 years later, how differently you might perceive that. You might say, well, wow, I guess 4 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have said this was a pretty good relationship, but given how fantastically, incredibly wonderful the new one is that I'm in, I don't think that last one was really that good at all, you know, by comparison. Or sometimes we just change our attitudes about things. Don't you, well, some of you, are there any parents in here besides me? No? This is one, and maybe you've already reached this age, but there's a lot of things that when you're younger, like when you're in your adolescent years, that you're really frustrated with your parents, and things that your parents do or don't do, and that they understand or that they don't understand. But then as you get older, you tend to go back and you tend to view that stuff entirely differently. There are so many things that when you were a kid, you absolutely hated your parents saying, that you oftentimes, at least sometimes, find yourself saying when you're a parent. You go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm saying that. I remember how much I hated that when I was 13 or 12. Well, a lot of times, we change our attitudes. We reframe our perception, and we might recall something and evaluate something differently now than we actually would have back at the time. And I guess this would be more related to the example I'm about to mention would be more related to the idea of accuracy as well. My example of how did the relationship start? Couldn't you see for some people that might be a difficult thing to actually even recall? I don't really know. You know, I don't really remember whether it was this or whether it was this. I don't remember what we were feeling on, you know, March 23rd of, 2007. So one of the limitations of the retrospective self-report is your data and information might not be as accurate as you would like it to be. One reason is people might just not recall things accurately. Another very good explanation is people might have changed since then and they reframe or they redefine things. On the flip side, one of the strong benefits of retrospective self-reports is it gives you access to data you otherwise wouldn't have access to, right? I mean, how can you study the way that people began a relationship when they're already in the relationship? I mean, you just say, well, I guess we can't study that. How would you study what people did when they were children? You can't really go and ask the kids. So, the only thing you can do is ask older people to try to reflect back and remember the things that you did when you were a kid. So one of the benefits of retrospective self-reports is it gives you access to a lot of information that you otherwise wouldn't have information to. If you could only ask people for what's going on here and now, that means everything in the past is something we just can't even study. It also can potentially give you access to what's called longitudinal data, and you don't need to worry about that now, but let me just mention it. We'll come back to this more in the second unit. Longitudinal data is where you're tracking the development of something over a sequence of time. And so if you're studying people right now, and you didn't study them at any previous time, you have no idea in terms of tracking information. How can you possibly track what had happened leading up to now if you can only study the here and the now? So also with retrospective self-reports, you can get some of that longitudinal data, where you can go back and you can say, here's a set of developments of things. And again, you can see how you might do that, asking somebody, what kind of relationship, did you perceive when you were in junior high or middle school compared to high school, compared to college, compared to, years later, that sort of thing. Now, there are a lot of longitudinal studies that are done where they start at an earlier age and they just keep tracking people. I think a great example is, and I think they still do this, I thought this was such a great thing. Duke University does this, or used to do this program called the Search for Excellence program. And what they would do is in 7th grade, a bunch of middle schoolers in 7th grade, they would take the SAT, the senior aptitude test that you take in your senior year of high school, but they would have 7th graders take it, 5 years early. And they would identify the top 1% in the nation of 7th graders that scored, the top 1%, the 99th percentile in 7th grade. And then they would keep track of those people, or at least as many of those people as they could keep a hold of, in terms of tracking their progress later and later down the line. What was their grade point average? How well did they do in middle school? How did they do in high school? What was their grade point average? Did they receive any honors? Did they go to college? you know, what was their grade point average in college? Did they get graduate degrees? What are they doing as a profession and a career? And this is great longitudinal information because you actually started identifying these kids, the 1% of the population, or at least a sample of them in 7th grade, and then, you know, you keep tracking them all along. It's just, that kind of thing is just a really neat thing. Well, that's not a retrospective self-report, but that kind of information you could potentially access with a retrospective self-report, which otherwise you couldn't. So, real consolidated summary here. The benefit of a retrospective self-report, you get access to a lot of information about the past that you otherwise wouldn't have. The limitation, there may be some questions about accuracy based on things like recall or changing your views. We do still have our, you know, 2 other kinds of measurements to do that we'll get into on Thursday. Keep your handouts with you because we'll come back to those in one way or another, some of them.